You ever feel like the world has forgotten you? That the dust and the wind and the endless sky have just sort of swallowed you up? That's how it was for me. The silence of a ranch is a heavy thing. It's not the absence of sound. It's the presence of a profound, aching emptiness that settles in your bones after so many years of talking to only yourself and the horses. You get to know the sound of your own heartbeat in a way that city folks never do. It becomes a kind of rhythm, a metronome for your loneliness. I'd made peace with it. I'd even started to prefer it. Then, one evening, the wind carried a different sound, a frail, human one, right to my door. And the note that came with it didn't just change my evening. It cracked the foundation of the entire world I'd built for myself. The wind was the only constant companion I had left. It had been my alarm clock for 30 years, howling across the high plains and rattling the loose shutter on the bunkhouse, and my lullaby at night, a mournful, restless song against the tin roof of the main house. I'd grown to understand its moods, the soft, teasing whisper of a spring morning, the hot, angry bellow of a summer thunderstorm, and the sharp, bitter hiss of a winter gale. But this evening, in the deep, bruised purple of a Texas twilight, it carried a new sound, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The old brain plays tricks on a man who's been alone too long. I'd convinced myself I'd heard my wife, Clara's, voice more times than I cared to count, always just on the edge of hearing, always gone when I turned my head. So when I thought I heard a child's whimper, thin and reedy, I dismissed it as a coyote pup or the squeal of a rabbit caught in a hawk's talons. I went back to my coffee, a bitter black brew that was only good for scorching the loneliness out of your throat. The clock on the mantel ticked with the same slow, ponderous rhythm it had for decades, a noise that was as much a part of the house as the creaking floorboards. Then I heard it again, a plaintive, shuddering sob followed by a shushing sound like someone was trying to console someone else. It was closer this time, right on my front porch. My hand froze, the chipped ceramic mug halfway to my lips. My heart, that old, sedentary organ, gave a clumsy lurch in my chest. I set the coffee down, the motion slow and deliberate. The old wariness, the protective shell I'd built, was still intact. Could be stragglers, drifters, maybe folks who'd had trouble with their car on the desolate stretch of road that passed for a highway 5 miles south of here. There were a lot of desperate folk in these parts, and not all of them were friendly. My old Remington 870 was in the corner, but my fingers didn't reach for it. Something in those sobs, they didn't sound like a threat. They sounded lost. I got up from my worn-out armchair, the springs groaning in protest. My knees, stiff from a day of mending fence, protested as I walked to the door. I could feel the draft seeping under it, a cold snake of air wrapping around my ankles. I paused for a second, my hand on the cool, tarnished brass of the knob, listening. The sounds outside were muffled, tiny, and full of a fear that was primal and ancient. I could hear the wind, and beneath it, the ragged breathing of someone trying very hard not to cry. When I finally swung the heavy oak door open, the world was a wash of twilight colors. The sky was a deep, bruised purple bleeding into black at the horizon, and the first stars were just starting to prick the velvet darkness. And there, huddled on my porch like a cluster of frightened prairie dogs, were 3 children. They were small, impossibly small. The oldest couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, a boy with a shock of dark hair and a face that was trying so hard to be brave it was heartbreaking. He stood in front of the other 2, his thin arms spread out like a shield, a gesture of protection that was both noble and utterly futile. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on me, filled with a fearful suspicion that looked far too old for his young face. Behind him, a little girl, maybe 6, was clinging to his shirt, her face buried in the worn fabric. Her small shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. And then there was the baby. He couldn't have been more than a year old, a tiny, helpless bundle wrapped in a faded pink blanket that was stained and dirty. He was tucked into the arms of the little girl, his face pale and his eyes closed. He wasn't crying. That's what scared me more than anything. A baby that small, that still in the cold night air. It wasn't natural. My voice, when I finally found it, was a rusty croak, What in tarnation? The boy's eyes didn't leave my face, but he spoke, his voice a high, tight whisper. Our ma, she said to wait here, she said you'd help us. He swallowed hard, a visible bob in his thin throat. She wrote you a note. I looked down then and saw a folded piece of paper, grubby and creased, on the dusty porch floorboards. It was pinned under a small, smooth stone, a piece of the endless earth that surrounded us. I stared at it. It was a tangible thing in a situation that felt utterly surreal. 3 children, alone, on my doorstep in the middle of nowhere with a note. The little girl sniffled, a wet, miserable sound. My arm hurts, she whimpered, her voice muffled by her brother's shirt. And Toby's really cold. The boy Toby, I assumed, shifted, trying to shield his sister and the baby from the wind. I could see his own body trembling, the thin fabric of his jacket doing little to ward off the chill. It was a long walk, he said, his voice cracking. We've been walking all day. Our ma, she couldn't keep up. That last sentence hung in the air, heavy with an implication I didn't want to face. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of the boy's hair across his eyes. He didn't bother to brush it away. He was watching me, waiting for me to be the monster his mother had probably warned him about, or the savior he desperately needed. His whole small, tense body was a question. I was a man who had planned his day by the sun, a man whose most pressing responsibility was to make sure the water troughs were full and the fences were mended. I had bills to pay, a roof to fix, and a horse that needed shoeing. My life was a simple, lonely routine of chores and silence. I had no room for this. Children were a foreign concept to me, a world of noise and chaos and constant need that I had long ago decided wasn't for me. That was Clara's dream, not mine. Her death had not only taken my future, it had solidified my past. But the note, the damn note, it was right there, physical evidence that this wasn't a hallucination, wasn't a trick of the light. This was real. These were real children, abandoned like a litter of kittens on my doorstep. My gaze shifted from the note to the baby, whose skin was taking on a bluish tinge in the fatting light. The boy was right. They were freezing. An internal war was raging in my chest. The cold logic of self-preservation was screaming at me to call the sheriff, to wash my hands of it. The fear of the unknown, of the responsibility, was a heavy stone in my gut. My own anxieties, my carefully curated solitude, was being threatened by 3 tiny, desperate people. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't the quiet, predictable end I had pictured for myself. They were bringing with them their hunger, their tears, their injuries, and a story I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. A story that was already written on their faces and in the trembling of their small bodies. My hand was still on the doorframe, my knuckles white. I was a man who had survived by being cautious, by not letting the world in. The ranch had been my fortress, but this was a siege I hadn't prepared for. The boy's gaze never wavered. He was putting all his faith in a piece of paper. Finally, the cold won out. Or maybe it was the memory of a promise I'd made to a woman on her deathbed, a promise to be a good man, even if she was the only one who ever believed I could be. I couldn't just let a baby freeze to death on my porch, not even for the sake of my carefully guarded peace. I let go of the door and took a step back, the movement stiff and unnatural. "All right, get inside," I growled, the words coming out harsher than I intended. "All of you, now." They scrambled past me, a flurry of dusty clothes and desperate energy. The boy Toby was the last, and he paused for a moment at the threshold, his dark eyes meeting mine. In them I saw a flicker of something. Was it relief, gratitude, or maybe just a profound wariness that was slowly being replaced by a glimmer of hope? He didn't speak. He just gave a small, curt nod, the gesture of an old man in a child's body. Then he turned and followed his sister into the warm, dimly lit house. I stood there for a moment longer, the door still wide open, the cold night air swirling around my legs. I looked down at the note again. I could see the faint, spidery handwriting through the paper, and I knew with a sick certainty that my life, the one I'd so carefully arranged, was about to be turned inside out. I bent down, my joints aching, and picked up the note. The stone that held it was cold and smooth in my palm. I turned it over, feeling its weight, the weight of the decision I had just made. Then I looked out into the darkening landscape, the wide-open spaces that had once been my solace. Now they just felt empty. I closed the door, shutting out the wind and the sounds of the night. I locked it, a symbolic act that felt both futile and necessary. I was locking the world out, but I had just let a whole new one in. My home, my sanctuary, was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of small, sniffling breaths and the quiet, unspoken story of a woman who had entrusted me, a complete stranger, with everything she had. The note felt heavy in my hand, heavier than it had any right to be. The first thing I noticed was the smell. My house, which for so long had only smelled of me, old coffee, dust, saddle soap, and the faint, musky scent of a solitary man, was suddenly filled with a new, complex aroma. It was the smell of dry, dusty children, of wind, of tears, and underneath it all, something sweet, like crushed flowers, and the faint, powdery scent of baby soap. It was a smell of life, and it was alien to my home. The three of them stood in a huddle in the middle of my living room, a tiny island of vulnerability in a sea of masculine austerity. The old cowboy furniture, the worn leather armchair, the heavy wooden table, the faded sepia photographs on the wall seemed to loom over them. The little girl, whose name I still didn't know, was clutching Toby's hand like it was a lifeline. Her eyes, wide and tear-stained, were darting around the room, taking in every detail, assessing every potential threat. The baby Toby was still cradled in her arms, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He looked like a small, wizened old man, his tiny face pale against the pink blanket. I stood there a few feet away, feeling utterly useless. This wasn't in my repertoire. I knew how to fix a fence, doctor a sick calf, and shoot a rattler. I did not know how to handle a frightened girl, a stoic boy, and a comatose baby. My hands, which were usually so steady, felt clumsy and awkward. "All right," I said, my voice a low rumble that was too loud in the heavy silence. Let's get you cleaned up." I gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "There's a basin and water." They didn't move. They just stared at me, their eyes full of a wary suspicion that cut me to the bone. I wasn't their enemy, but I was a stranger, a giant of a man in a strange house, and their world had just been turned upside down. They were in survival mode, a state I understood better than most. "My ma said not to trust anyone," Toby finally said, his voice a quiet challenge. "But she said she knew you. She said you were okay." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Knew me?" I repeated, the words tasting strange in my mouth. How could she possibly? I stopped myself. The note. I was still holding it, crumpled in my hand. The answer was in there. The truth of this bizarre situation was in that piece of paper. But the moment I read it, it would become real. It would be a spoken truth, a documented truth, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. "For now, just sit down," I ordered, forcing a gruffness into my voice to mask my confusion. "I need to get the fire going. It's getting cold in here." I busied myself with the wood stove, a familiar mechanical task that helped ground me. I could feel their eyes on my back, a silent, heavy presence. I felt like a zoo animal being observed. But the silence was broken by a soft, whining sound. It was the baby. He was finally stirring. "He's hungry," the little girl whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "He hasn't eaten since yesterday." Yesterday? My stomach clenched. These children had been walking for hours, for most of a day, carrying a baby, and they were hungry. I couldn't even begin to fathom what kind of desperation would lead a mother to do something like this, to abandon her children to a stranger's care. I turned from the stove, the fire now crackling to life. "All right, let's see what we have." My pantry was a sad, sparse affair, but I managed to find some powdered milk, a can of beans, and a half-empty bag of hardtack biscuits. It was hardly a feast, but it was something. I put a pot of water on the stove to heat. While I was working, I snuck glances at them. Toby had begun to move, his wariness slightly abated by the warmth of the fire. He helped his sister, whose name I learned was Rosie, settle the baby Thomas onto a worn patchwork quilt on the floor. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost eerie, a child who had been forced to grow up far too fast. He was a parent to his siblings now. The silence was a thick, living thing between us, broken only by the crackling fire and the hiss of the water heating. They were waiting for me to read the note. They were waiting for me to decide their fate. The weight of their expectation was a physical burden on my shoulders. I was a coward. I was avoiding the truth. The baby's whimpering grew louder, a thin, reedy cry that tugged at something deep in my chest. I had only ever seen a baby this close a handful of times in my life. They were fragile, terrifying things, like tiny, delicate birds that could break if you looked at them the wrong way. I watched as Rosie, with the instinct of a little mother, tried to soothe her brother, stroking his cheek with a tiny, grubby hand. It wasn't working. The cry became more insistent, a desperate, hungry wail that filled the room and seemed to echo off the walls. My own anxieties were a dull roar in my ears. What was I supposed to do? I wasn't a father. I'd never even wanted to be one. I'd loved Clara and she dreamed of a house full of children, but her sickness had stolen that dream. And then it had stolen her. After she died, the idea of children was just a reminder of what I'd lost, a path I'd been denied. I'd buried that part of me so deep that I thought it was gone. But now, this tiny, helpless creature was crying, and I was the only one who could help him. I started, my voice faltering. I gestured helplessly at the baby. Can I try? Rosie looked at me with her big, frightened eyes and then slowly nodded. I felt a surge of nervousness that was completely out of proportion to the task at hand. My hands, the hands I'd used to rope steers and build fences, were shaking as I leaned down and carefully, tentatively lifted the baby from the floor. He was so small, so weightless in my arms, a bundle of bones and soft flannel. I cradled him against my chest, one hand awkwardly supporting his head, just like I'd seen in pictures. I had no idea what I was doing. As I held him, a strange, powerful wave of emotion washed over me. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was more like a profound sense of responsibility, a fierce protectiveness that I hadn't known I was capable of. A deep primal instinct that had lain dormant for decades was suddenly ignited. This wasn't a reminder of a lost dream. It was a new reality, a new responsibility. The baby was tiny, but he was a lot to hold. He was the weight of the world. The crying began to subside. He didn't stop, but it became a quieter, hiccuping sob, as if my presence was just enough of a distraction to calm him. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't going to be a complete disaster. But there was still the note. It was burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't avoid it anymore. I gently handed the baby back to Rosie, who looked at me with a newfound, fragile trust in her eyes. My heart felt like it was in a vice. I walked to the other side of the room, by the window. The night outside was a black velvet shroud and the stars were fierce and cold. I pulled the crumpled note from my pocket. The paper was soft and worn, as if it had been read and folded many times. I looked at the spidery, elegant handwriting. It was feminine, a hurried, desperate scrawl. I took a deep, ragged breath and began to read. "Dear Mr. Harding," it began. I blinked. Mr. Harding. No one called me that. I was just Silas. Silas to the men I worked with, old man to the few folks in town who knew me. Mr. Harding was a stranger. "I know you don't know me, but I know your story. I know about Clara. I was her nurse in the hospital in the end. She never stopped talking about you. She showed me your picture. She told me about your ranch, your life, your dreams. She told me you were the best man she ever knew, the kindest, the bravest. She said you had a big heart, even if you tried to hide it." My breath caught in my throat. Clara, my Clara, a ghost from the past, reaching out from beyond the grave to guide me in the most unexpected way. I remembered her in her hospital bed, her thin, pale face, her hand grasping mine. She talked about the nurses, the kind ones, the ones who made her last days a little less terrifying. One nurse in particular, she'd said, a woman with sad eyes who was about to become a mother herself. I remembered Clara talking about her, about how she told her about the ranch, about the wide-open spaces, about the silence. I'd thought it was just Clara's way of coping, of dreaming of a life she could no longer have. It hadn't been a dream. It was a legacy, a lifeline. I looked up from the note, my eyes finding the 3 children. The mother, the one who wrote this, was that nurse. I could see it now. A faint ghost of Clara's own features in Rosie's small, pinched face, in the stubborn set of Toby's jaw. My wife's final act of kindness. This woman, this stranger, had heard my wife's voice, and in her darkest hour she had remembered it, remembered my name, and trusted it to save her children. My hands were shaking now. I had to keep reading. I am sick, Silas, very sick. The same thing that took your Clara. I don't have much time left, and I have no one else. Their father is gone. I have no family. I have nothing except a desperate hope that you are the man she said you were. The words blurred before my eyes. I blinked, and a single tear escaped, tracing a cold path down my cheek. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, ashamed of my own emotion, but I couldn't help it. The enormity of what was happening was finally crashing down on me. This woman was dying. She was losing her life, and she was entrusting me with everything she loved. Everything. Her 3 children. Her entire world. I have tried to get to your ranch for 2 days. I can't make it. I can feel myself fatting. I know you will find them at your door. Please, please don't turn them away. Don't let them be sent to strangers, to an orphanage. Please give them a home, Silas. Give them the life I can't. Let Clara's heart live on in them. They are all I have. They are all I am, please. The note ended with a single trembling signature. Evelyn, and with all my love, thank you. I stood there in the silence of my own home, the note trembling in my hand. The fire crackled. The baby Thomas was quiet now. Toby and Rosie were watching me, their faces pale in the flickering light. They were waiting. They were putting all their hope in a dead woman's words and a lonely man's heart. This wasn't just a note. It was a will. It was a dying woman's last testament, and I was her executor. The burden was staggering. How could I, a lonely, broken old man, take on 3 children? How could I give them the life their mother wanted for them? I had no idea how to be a father. I had spent my whole life making sure I didn't have to. All my carefully constructed walls, my defenses against the pain and responsibility of a life fully lived, had been breached. But as I looked at them, at this tiny, terrified family that had been handed to me, I didn't just see a burden. I saw a flicker of something else. I saw a second chance. A chance to honor Clara's memory in a way I'd never imagined. A chance to give meaning to all the years I'd spent hiding from the world. The isolation that had become my shelter could now become their sanctuary. The silence I had grown to love could now be filled with laughter and life. I was scared. I was terrified. But as I looked at Toby's tired, brave face and Rosie's tear-streaked cheeks, a quiet resolve began to form in my chest. I wasn't just a rancher anymore. I was a protector, a guardian. I was the man Evelyn had trusted with her children, the man Clara had believed I could be. I walked toward them, the note still in my hand. I knelt down in front of them, my old knees cracking. They flinched but didn't back away. I looked at Toby, then at Rosie. "Your ma, she knew my wife," I said, my voice hoarse. "Your ma helped her when she was sick, my wife. She was a good woman, the best. And she told your ma about me, about this place." Toby's eyes were wide. "She said you'd help us," he whispered, echoing his words from the porch. I nodded slowly, the movement heavy with meaning. She was right. The words felt like a promise, a vow spoken into the vast, empty silence of my life. She was right. And in that moment, I wasn't just a lonely cowboy anymore. I was a father. The cowboys, the wranglers, they were all gone now. It was just me and them, 3 children and a man who didn't know what he was doing. It was a new world, and I was, for the first time in a very long time, not alone. The first week was a war. Not against any enemy, but against chaos, against the sheer, overwhelming force of 3 small lives. The quiet I had cultivated for so long, the sacred silence of my home, was shattered by a cacophony of sounds I had no name for. There was the thin, reedy cry of Thomas in the middle of the night, a sound that would jolt me from a dead sleep with my heart pounding. There was the constant, low murmur of Toby and Rosie's whispered conversations, a stream of consciousness that seemed to have no beginning or end. And there was the clatter, the endless, unceasing clatter of small hands and feet on the old wooden floors. I was a man ill-equipped for this new reality. My skills were with horses and cattle, not with children. I could mend a fence, but I couldn't mend a broken toy. I could doctor a sick calf, but I couldn't figure out why Thomas was crying. He seemed to be in a state of constant, low-grade misery, a tiny, red-faced testament to my incompetence. The powdered milk I'd mixed was either too thick or too thin, and he'd spit it out with a look of pure disgust, his wails echoing through the house like a siren. My mornings, which had once been spent in peaceful routine, were now a frantic scramble of trying to soothe a crying baby while making sure Toby and Rosie had something to eat. Toby was my anchor in the storm. He was a quiet, stoic presence, his eyes constantly moving, assessing, anticipating needs before they could be voiced. He was a child who had been forced to grow up, and he bore the weight of his new responsibility with a grim determination. The first morning he found me in the kitchen, struggling to get the stove to light, my hands fumbling with the matches. "Let me," he'd said, his voice soft but firm. I'd watched, feeling humiliated as he expertly coaxed a flame from the kindling, his small hands surprisingly steady. "Ma taught me," he'd explained, not looking at me. "Had to. She was too sick to do it a lot of the time." His words were a knife in my gut. He'd been caring for his dying mother. He'd been the man of the house long before he'd arrived on my porch. The skill I'd been so impressed by wasn't a gift. It was a necessity born from tragedy. He knew how to sew, too, with a neat, tiny stitch that I could barely see. He'd found a tear in Rosie's dress and had fixed it without a word, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a small, quiet soldier, fighting a war no child should have to fight. Rosie was the opposite. She was an open book, her emotions written plainly on her face and in her actions. She was terrified of me at first, flinching if I walked too quickly or spoke too loudly. She'd spend hours clinging to Toby's side, her big, dark eyes watching me with a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated fear. But she was also fiercely protective of Thomas, her tiny body a shield against any potential harm. She would sing to him, a soft, tuneless lullaby that she must have learned from her mother, and stroke his cheek until he quieted. It was in those moments that I saw a ghost of Clara's gentle nature, and it made my heart ache with a pain I thought I'd buried long ago. And then there was Thomas, the baby. He was my biggest challenge, a tiny, demanding creature who seemed to have a personal vendetta against my sanity. He cried. He cried for food, he cried for comfort, he cried because the wind was blowing or the sun was shining, or because he was simply Thomas and that was his way. I'd never felt so utterly helpless in my life. I was a giant in this world, my hands too big, my voice too loud, my very presence overwhelming for this small, fragile soul. I was terrified of dropping him, of hurting him, of failing him the way I felt I had failed everyone else. The nights were the worst. The darkness was heavy and the sounds of the ranch, the creaking of the house, the howl of a distant coyote seemed amplified 1,000-fold. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the small sounds of their breathing from the spare room I'd hastily set up. And I'd think about Evelyn, sick and alone, walking for 2 days to get her children to me. I'd think about her final act of desperation, her faith in a man she'd never met, a man her patient had spoken of with such love. The weight of that trust was a physical presence in the room, pressing down on me, a constant reminder of the promise I'd made. But it wasn't all chaos and anxiety. There were moments, fleeting and precious, that pierced the darkness and filled me with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. One afternoon I was in the yard, mending a bridle. I looked up and Rosie was standing at the edge of the porch, watching me. She'd finally emerged from the safety of Toby's shadow. "My ma said you have horses," she said, her voice a quiet, curious whisper. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am, 3 of them." Can I see them? I hesitated. The horses were big and she was so small, but the look in her eyes, a mix of hope and fear, was irresistible. I set down the bridle. All right, but you stay right by me, you hear? She nodded solemnly. I led her to the corral, my heart pounding. The horses were gentle, but they were still horses. I watched her as she stood at the fence, her tiny hands gripping the weathered wood. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open in wonder. One of the mares, a gentle old bay named Bess, ambled over, curious about the new small creature. Don't be scared, I said softly. Just hold out your hand, let her smell you. Rosie hesitated, then slowly, tentatively, extended her hand. Bess sniffed her fingers, her warm breath misting in the cool air. Rosie gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. A wide, radiant smile broke across her face, a smile that transformed her entire being. It was the first time I'd seen her truly happy. It was also the first time I felt like I might not be failing. That night when I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Mr. Harding," she whispered. "Yes, Rosie. Are you going to be our new pa?" The question hit me like a runaway horse. My throat tightened and I couldn't speak for a moment. I looked at her small, trusting face and I saw a future I'd never allowed myself to imagine. My heart ached with the weight of the possibility and the fear of it. I'm doing my best," I finally managed, the words coming out in a rough whisper. She just smiled, a small, sleepy smile, and closed her eyes. She was asleep within seconds, her breathing soft and even. I stood there in the dark of her room, the silence heavy around me, and I felt like I was on the precipice of a chasm. My whole life had been a preparation for a life alone. I'd thought I'd accepted that. I'd thought I'd made peace with it. But as I looked at her, a tiny, fragile creature who had put her complete trust in me, I realized I hadn't been living. I'd just been existing, waiting. And I'd been waiting for a purpose, a reason to break free from the prison of my own making. The world outside my door was still vast and uncaring. The loneliness that had been my companion for so long was a familiar ache. But there was a new ache now, a deeper one, a fierce protectiveness that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I would do anything for this child, for all of them. I would die for them. And that's when I knew in that moment that my whole life, all my pain and loss had been leading me to this. It was a purpose I never expected, but it was mine. I was a guardian now, a father in all but name. The heart I'd kept locked away was no longer my own. It belonged to them. The next morning I went to the corral early before the children were awake. I saddled my best horse, a tall, sturdy gelding named Scout. I had a long journey ahead of me. I needed to find Evelyn. I needed to know the truth, to get the full story from her, and to make a promise to her in person. A promise to care for her children. A promise to give them the life she wanted for them. As I rode out, the sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of a sleeping house, a house full of life. The silence was no longer an empty, aching void. It was a peaceful pause, a breath before the day's noise would begin anew. I looked back at the house, and I could see a small light in the kitchen window. Toby was up, getting the fire started. A small, brave gesture that brought a lump to my throat. I turned Scout towards the distant hills and urged him into a steady lope. I had a woman to find, a promise to make, and a new life to build. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in decades, the future felt less like a curse and more like a promise. I found her in a small, forgotten town called Mercy, a place as desolate and broken as the woman I was searching for. The clerk at the single, dusty general store had seen her. He pointed me to a small, run-down boarding house on the edge of town, a place that seemed to be clinging to existence by a thread. My heart was a heavy stone in my chest as I knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet street. An old woman, her face a map of wrinkles and weariness, opened the door. She stared at me with suspicion, her hand clutching a worn wooden cross at her throat. "What do you want?" she rasped. "Ma'am," I said, my voice rough, "I'm looking for a woman, Evelyn. She's sick. She might be staying here." The old woman's eyes softened, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "You're the one," she whispered. "The one from the ranch. She said you'd come." She opened the door wider. "She's in the back room. She's been asking for you. She's not long for this world." I walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway, my boots echoing on the creaking floorboards. I had no idea what I was going to say. How do you thank someone who has entrusted you with their entire world? How do you live up to that kind of faith? I paused at the door, my hand raised to knock, when I heard a soft, weak voice from inside. "Come in." I pushed the door open. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A single window was covered by a thin, yellowed curtain, letting in a pale, sickly light. On a narrow bed lay a woman, her face as white as the sheets. She was thin, so painfully thin, and the blue veins in her wrists and temples were stark against her skin. Her hair, a dark, lank fall, was spread out on the pillow, but her eyes, when they met mine, were vibrant. They were deep, dark, and filled with a desperate, hopeful fire. "Mr. Harding," she whispered, a weak smile touching her lips, "you came." I was rooted to the spot. The ghost of Clara, the one I'd seen in the children, was here too. It was in the set of her jaw, the way she held her head, a quiet dignity even in the face of death. I took a tentative step forward. "The children are safe," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're fine, Evelyn. They're at the ranch." Tears welled in her eyes and she let out a shuddering breath. "Thank God," she breathed. I didn't know. I was so afraid they'd be found by the wrong people." She struggled to sit up, but I moved forward, a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't," I said, "just rest." "I can't rest," she said, her voice gaining a sudden fierce strength. "I have to know, will you keep them?" Her eyes searched my face, desperate for an answer. "I know it's too much to ask a stranger, but I have no one else. They have no one else." I thought about the chaos of the past week. I thought about the sleepless nights, the endless crying, the constant, overwhelming responsibility. I thought about my quiet life, the peace I had so carefully constructed. And then I thought about Rosie's smile, the first time she'd seen the horse. I thought about the way Toby looked at me, with a respect that was more precious than any adult's approval. I thought about the feel of baby Thomas in my arms, a tiny, fragile life that was now my responsibility. "I didn't know," I said slowly, the words forming in my mind as I spoke them. "I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't think I could, but they already feel like mine, Evelyn. They feel like my own." The tears that had been welling in her eyes finally spilled over, tracing silent paths down her pale cheeks. A sob caught in her throat, a sound of relief and of profound, heartbreaking grief. She was losing her life, but her children were safe. Her Bobbies, her everything would be okay. "You don't know what that means to me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Clara, she was right about you. She was right." I sat down on the chair beside her bed, my body heavy with a deep, profound emotion. I took her hand, a bony, fragile thing, in mine. It was cold. "Tell me about them," I said. "Tell me about your children." And she did. She talked for hours, her voice weak but her words full of a fierce love. She told me about Toby's quiet, steady nature. How he'd always been her little man, helping her when he was barely old enough to walk. She told me about Rosie's beautiful singing, her gentle heart, and how she would sit for hours, talking to her dolls in the soft, lilting voice of a future mother. And she told me about Thomas, the child who was born just as her sickness was getting worse, the one she'd worried she wouldn't be able to care for. She spoke of all the little things, the memories she was desperately trying to preserve. I listened, my heart aching, understanding that I was the only one who could keep those memories alive now. She told me about Clara too. She told me about the long days in the hospital, how Clara had talked about the ranch as if it were a paradise. She told me how Clara had a picture of me, a faded photograph from our wedding day that she kept by her bed. My eyes burned with tears, a picture of a young man full of hope, the man I used to be, the man she had believed in. As the day began to fade, Evelyn grew weaker. Her grip on my hand loosened and her words became slower, more labored. She talked about the ranch, about how she'd imagined the children there, running through the fields. She told me she hoped they would be happy. And then, just as the sun was setting, painting the sickly yellow room in shades of orange and gold, she looked at me one last time. Her eyes were open, but they were distant, looking at something I couldn't see. "Tell Toby he's a good boy," she whispered. "Tell Rosie. Tell her I'll always love her. Tell Thomas. Tell him about me. Please, Silas, don't let him forget me." I squeezed her hand, my throat so tight I couldn't speak. "I promise," I finally choked out. A peaceful smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." And then she was gone. The faint light in her eyes faded and her hand went limp in mine. The room was silent. A profound, heavy silence that was more profound than any I had ever known. Evelyn, the woman who had trusted me with her soul, was gone. I had a promise to keep. I had 3 children to raise. I sat with her for a long time as the last light of the day faded from the sky. I remembered her face, her voice, her stories. I knew it would be my job to pass them on. I was their last connection to her, their memory, a stranger who had become their guardian. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. Finally, I stood up. I looked down at her one last time, a woman I had only known for a single day, but a woman who had changed my life forever. "Thank you, Evelyn," I whispered to the silent room. "I won't let you down." The ride back to the ranch was long. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light on the landscape. I was bone-weary, but my heart was full of grief, full of responsibility, and full of a strange, unfamiliar hope. I was going home. I was going home to my children. When I arrived, the house was dark. I slipped in quietly, not wanting to wake them. I walked to the room where they were sleeping. I stood in the doorway looking at them. They were a tangle of limbs and blankets, 3 small, sleeping figures, my children. The thought was still foreign, but it was no longer terrifying. It was a truth, a powerful, unshakable truth. Toby stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He saw me and his face broke into a relieved smile. "You're back," he whispered. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "I'm back." He sat up, his eyes searching my face. "Did you find her? Did you see her?" His voice was trembling. My heart ached for him. "I did. She was very sick. She talked about you, all of you. She loved you so much." A single tear slid down his cheek. Is she gone?" I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. I crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed. "She's gone, Toby, but she told me something. She told me to tell you that you're a good boy, the best, and she wanted me to tell you that she'll always love you." He was crying now, silent, heart-wrenching sobs that shook his small frame. I didn't know what to do. I had no experience with this kind of grief. So I did the only thing that felt right. I reached out and pulled him into a hug, a fierce, awkward embrace. He was stiff at first, then he melted into me, his small arms wrapping around my neck, his tears soaking into my shirt. Rosie woke up and saw us. She didn't ask any questions. She just scrambled out of her bed and crawled into my lap, burying her face in my chest. And then little Thomas, as if sensing the commotion, started to cry. I looked at them, 3 broken, grieving children, and I saw their future. It was a future full of challenges, of tears, of laughter, and of the slow, painstaking process of healing. And I saw my future too. I was no longer a cowboy facing a lonely, empty horizon. I was a father, and I had 3 children who needed me. I was their new beginning. I was their home, and I knew in my heart that I would not fail them. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I would walk it with them every step of the way. The weight of the promise was heavy, but my heart was full, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. That night as I held them, the world outside was silent, but our world, the little world we were building inside, was filled with the sound of our shared breathing, the smell of tears and dust, and the tiny, fragile, unbreakable hope of a new family. It was, I realized, the sound of a life finally, truly beginning.